As part of my design team duties over at the Counterfeit Kit Challenge, we make our own supplies once a month. They call it Forgery on the 4th over there. I call it my monthly makes. We take inspiration from real-world products and create our own versions. This video is a compilation video of 3 separate ideas that I released concurrently that featured homemade metal charms, stuffed stars, and postage stamp collage embellishments. Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty, where I create with paper and photos in artful ways. Let's get started with recreating those metal charms. I am going to use shrink plastic to do this. You could use clay. There's lots of other ways to do this, but I have shrink plastic in my stash, so that's what I'm going to use. There are different grades of shrink plastic. I'm using a smooth white. Some of them will say pre-sanded, and sometimes the sanding of the shrink plastic helps things like inks stick to the plastic. I'm not worrying about that today. The big thing to think about is that shrink plastic shrinks. It can shrink by half or more of its original size. So here's a little illustration of what that might look like. So I'm starting with the finished size I want my charms to be, and then I'm doubling that size. And I will cut my shrink plastic with this rotary trimmer. I like this one because it is a multimedia trimmer and it's a self-sharpening blade. If all you have is a paper trimmer, dedicate a blade to cutting plastic because it will ruin it for cutting paper. All right, I have created my charms at 1 inch by 2 inches big. I'm going to round off the corners with this paper rounder. Not all paper rounders will cut through plastic. This is a Spellbinder's corner rounder, and it does a good job with thicker materials. So I'm going to link that up to you below. If you have a corner rounder that's not quite up to the task, you might want to invest in a new one. It also has a notch side on the other end, just FYI. All right, I am going to pre-punch little holes in my charms because charms have holes to hang them off of bracelets and such. Of course, I'm going to use these in paper crafting, so I can maybe tie a ribbon or a bow through there. This hole punch is not a standard hole punch. I believe it's a 1/8 inch hole punch. If I can find something like that, I will link you up to that as well. And it's important to punch the holes before you shrink this plastic because it gets too thick to punch once it is fully shrunk. All right, the next step of these charms is to make them metallic, and I'm going to do that with a pigment ink. This pigment ink will not dry just sitting on plastic. It has to be heat set. Because the charms need heat to shrink, that will do both jobs at the same time. However, until that ink is heat set, it will smudge and smear and get on your fingers, so you want to handle it carefully. Notice this is a little bit splotchy. That's normal on plastic. It doesn't bother me. If you want it to be smoother, you can use a sponge dauber to kind of smooth it out, or even use that sponge dauber to apply it directly instead of doing what I did by pressing it into the pad. Either way, it's going to shrink and it will look less splotchy no matter what you do. You will get a smoother texture in the end if you use the sponge dauber. All right, I am going to partially heat set my ink so that the next step I work on will be a little easier to work with. That hole that we punched in the plastic is going to do a couple of jobs for us. It's going to help us hold these charms in place as we work with the heat tool because that can tend to blow it around. And while I'm heat setting this part, I don't want to heat it enough to shrink it. So I'm moving the heat on and off of that over time so that if I see any little curling or wiggling of the plastic, I will move the heat away so that it doesn't shrink yet. All right, I wanted to show you on a non-inked tag how I'm going to add letters and words to these tags. And I want to do this so that you can see it a little more clearly. And also you can totally skip the metallic option of pigment ink because that is very messy. I have an alphabet set that is probably discontinued long ago that is just the right size letters for making words. If you don't have an alphabet set that would work for this, I'll show you another way to do this in a little bit. I am going to align my alphabet set so that my words are nice and even, and then I'm going to ink them up with Stays-On ink. That is a permanent solvent-based ink which will work on plastic and it will dry on its own on plastic. It does take couple minutes to completely dry before it is smudge proof, but you can see I had my thumb over the O and it didn't smear. You can also layer up this ink to make it darker to a point, and get more detail on those. So I did it 2 times and I was satisfied with this. Now, if you're stamping directly onto that pigment ink, it's going to peel up some of that pigment ink. You can see how it looks splotchy there. And that pigment ink will get on your stamp and will transfer to your other ink pad. So what you can do is go ahead and use a clean stamp, press it into your pigment ink, and clean off that pigment ink as it transferred to your stamp. Now your charm is prepped to take that stays on ink. And here you can see it wasn't perfect, so I needed to add more layers. But if you take the time to do this step, you can get some good word impressions. Now that our charms are decorated how we want them, let's talk about heat setting. So you can see in the corner, my heat tool doesn't quite reach under my camera. That is a heat embossing tool. The other tool that I used was the Ranger heat drying tool. You can use it for embossing, but it has a fan speed and a lower heat output. So that one was good for heat setting the ink. This one has much higher fan setting, higher heat output, and it is good for shrinking plastic. You can shrink this plastic in the oven, and the instructions that come with the shrink plastic will detail how to do it in the oven. I like to do it at my desk because it's convenient. As you can see, it can blow away on you, which is why I'm using that hole to hold it down. And I'm sorry I couldn't get everything on camera, but I'm trying to get as much as I can here so that you can see once it starts heating up, it goes pretty quickly. It will curl up on itself, but as it completely shrinks, it will straighten out again. It will not completely flatten, so I put an acrylic block over the top of it to help that final flattening process. And of course, I'm doing all of this on a heat-proof silicone mat so that I don't damage anything. And here you can see the final shrinkage, and it is actually more than half the size smaller than before. So it's less than 1/2 inch by 1 inch, which was my goal size, but I'm happy with how it came out, and I am ready to move on. Now here I have inked this charm and heat set it with that pigment ink, and as you can see, there's not ink really transferring. However, when you heat set these, the plastic thickens up, and now the sides are no longer the metallic color, they're the white of the plastic. And I'm just going to ink these sides again and heat set them again. This time I can use my other tool, which isn't going to blow my charm away as much, and I just heat it up until I can kind of see the plastic flexing again, which means it's gone into that shrinking mode. And once it's doing that, then I can re-put one of those acrylic blocks over the top. I will know that it is completely hot and set, and after it's cooled off, I will test it again just to make sure that there's no ink transfer, and I'm done. Okay, if you did not have stamps to add messages to these charms back in the beginning, you can add them after the fact with a Sharpie. I'm using a very fine point Sharpie here, so I can just handwrite on these. You can use block letters. I'm going to write the word love in cursive, and you can mix and match fonts and do whatever you like if you're using a Sharpie after the fact. I don't have stamps small enough to stamp messages on the charms after they're shrunk, so I would have to use a Sharpie in that way. I do clean off the tip of my Sharpie because that ink can reactivate the metallic ink a little bit and clog up the tip of your Sharpie. All right, and here is all my charms in all of the ways I have decorated them after the fact, and I will leave you with a close-up of those, and then we can move on to the next idea. Next up, let's make some stuffed felt stars. I am going to die cut these stars I have nested star dies from Pink Fresh Studio, and I'm going to cut them out of felt. You can cut them out of regular fabric, but many fabrics will fray. So if you do use a regular fabric, you can add dabs of glue to the edges of the fabric to prevent them from fraying and falling apart. And then you can use whatever fabric you want. Now, felt normally does die cut. This happens to be an extra thick felt. If you're having trouble die cutting your felt, put a layer of cardstock or even 2 layers of cardstock underneath your felt where the die cuts into all of that. That helps the felt, or rather that helps the die have more space to push down, and gets you a cleaner cut. Now, even with a couple of shims, you may still have, with these extra thick felts, some places where it is holding on by threads of fabric. Go ahead and just snip them apart with scissors and you should be good. Now, the normal felt that I use is just regular craft felt from the craft store, and I had no problems die cutting that. You can see it off over there. I'm going to use DMC floss to sew these together, and this is DMC 926 in case you like this color. I'm going to be sewing using a blanket stitch, which I don't usually do. And if you've never done it, don't know what it is, I will show you in detail how to do this. The first thing to do is to cut off a length of your floss and then pull out the threads. If you hold it from the top, grab one thread and then just pull it straight up. The bottom threads will kind of curl up in your hand, but for some reason, they don't tangle. So once you have those 3 threads pulled apart, line them all back up on the end, and then I'm a licker. I will lick my threads to help me with the needle threading process. You can use a sponge and dampen your fingers and do that. You could also use this needle threading tool, which has a much wider space on a thin metal eye, I guess you can call it, that you can put your needle over that space and then thread your threads through the larger eye. And then once you get all of that, oh, I took it off camera to lick it, pardon me. But once you get it through there, then you can pull your needle over the thread and through the eye, and then that helps you thread your needles. This is not a typical sewing needle. This is an embroidery needle, so you want to have some of those on hand. So let's go back here for a second. When I pull my thread through the needle, I'm going to leave a tail. You can kind of see it dangling down there. And you want your tail to be about half the length of your total thread. Now we're going to talk about tail tips at the end of the video. If you're not used to tying knots, what I like to do is put it over my finger, wrap it across itself, and then take that kind of tail with my thumb and roll it. And then once I roll it, that'll let me pinch it with my fingernail so that I can grab it with my other fingernail and pull down so that you have a knot. Hopefully all that made sense, but you do have the rewind and slow features on YouTube if you need to see that again. Before we get into the details of how to do this stitch, this is what we're aiming for, and you can see it's a decorative stitch that has a row of thread that follows the edge of the fabric, so it creates a nice finished look. If you don't want to hand stitch, you can certainly do these on a sewing machine, or you could just hot glue them together. Just leave an opening so that you can stuff it before you finish gluing. All right, let's get started with our stitching tutorial. So to get started, I like to stitch up from the inside of my fabric, and that will help hide that knot that we've made. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so that you can see the details of this tutorial better. I'm going to keep this in real time. So I bring my thread up through the inside of that fabric. That knot is now inside. I kind of tuck it down so it doesn't stick out the edge. And then I'm going to just loop my thread right around and come back up through all the layers of fabric from the back side up through that same stitch that I took to anchor my knot in there. So I pull my needle up, and here's a little bit of a tip. If you find that your thread on the back side is starting to curl and tangle, you can stick your finger in there and that'll prevent it from tangling up on you. All right, so I've left a loop as I pulled that through, and then I'm going to stick my needle back through that loop. And again, I'm using my finger to help things not tangle up. And then I'm going to pull that snug, not tight, but snug, straight out from that stitch. And that's going to kind of anchor that thread now at the edge of my fabric. And then I'm going to take the next stitch along an imaginary line that is kind of even with the edge. If you can't imagine that line, you can go ahead and draw it on with like a chalk, and that'll help. You can just rub away and erase that chalk later, and that'll help you keep your stitches even and straight. I don't worry about it too much. I'm not the most even stitcher in the world, so I just do my best. All right, I'm doing it again. Let's take it a couple more times before we move on to the next step. So I've got my thread anchored at the edge. I'm going to come over a little bit, take a stitch, and then before I pull that stitch tight, I'm going to put my thread through that loop. And that helps that thread pull across the edge of the fabric as I anchor it into the next loop, which is what we're going to do here. So take a stitch through your loop, pull it straight out to keep it snug. And you may need to kind of pull your previous loop a little bit to snug it up as you move forward, depending on how the quality of your fabric and the quality of your thread and so forth. You may need to just keep snugging it up on the previous loop before you move on to the next one. All right, so here I'm snugging it up a little bit more, and I'm going to keep going. Corners need a little bit of a different process, and an inside corner is different than an outside pointy corner. So let's talk about this inside corner first. I'm going to finish off my previous stitch by making my new stitch right at the angle of that point. So I'm going to pull that tight. Now this second time, I'm not going to move over for a new stitch. I'm going to go back in that same stitch. This is exactly like we did when we started stitching to begin with. So next I'm going to bring my needle out through that same stitch, and I'm going to go ahead and loop my thread through and pull it tight right where it is. This anchors the thread in the corner, and if you don't do that anchor stitch, it can tend to cause a gap between the thread and the edge of the fabric when you take the next stitch, which I'm doing right now. And this double stitching in that inside corner helps anchor that thread so that it lays flat along the edge of your fabric. Okay, let's talk about outside corners, and this is where my skills are not the best. Just know that there may be way better ways to do this, but I'm going to show you how I do it, and if this doesn't work for you, you may be able to find something better. All right, I have just taken my last stitch before I've gotten to the corner, so notice where it is, it's nearly in the corner. So what we're going to do is go back into that same stitch, and we're going to work it the same way we do by taking our stitch and pulling our needle through the loop, but we're going to pull that thread towards the tip of the corner. Now this isn't anchored to anything at that tip, so we need to be careful when we pull it taut. We don't want to pull it so tight that it's going to scrunch up the fabric or slip off the edge. And as we take our next stitch again through that same space, we're going to want to pinch it with our fingernails to hold it so that it doesn't slip off the edge of our fabric, and then we're left with the blanket stitch that has gone awry and not following the edge of our fabric anymore. All right, once we get around that corner, we can continue on with our stitching, but let's do it again a little slower one more time. We've finished our last stitch. Our next stitch comes up through that same hole. We will pull our loop, thread through the loop, pull it snug towards the tip of the star. Careful not to pull too tight. Here I'm adjusting it. Next third stitch back through the same hole. Pull our thread, needle and thread through the loop. Pull it snug, not too snug. Hold your threads in place so it doesn't slip off the edge. Snug up that stitch, and then go ahead and take your next stitch. You might still want to keep your finger on that previous stitch so that it doesn't slip as you take the future stitches. Notice I'm just kind of adjusting it so that everything seems to be even before I move on. And then I will hold that stitch all in place and then take that next stitch. I will have a couple more sewing tips for you at the end, but let's go ahead and get to the next part of this project. When you get to almost back to the beginning, you want to leave a hole so that you can stuff it with fiberfill. I just saved fiberfill out of an old pillow, and I just grabbed a handful, stuffed it in a Ziploc bag, and threw the rest away because there was more fiberfill than I can use in a lot of projects. So that's what I've got here. I do kind of pull it off to fluff it up a little bit more because it was pretty compacted down from being in a pillow. And then I will just shove it in that hole. I leave the hole big enough so that one of my little fingers can fit in there. I just use my index finger here. And then a pencil will help you shove that fiberfill into corners, depending on your shape. If you're doing round shapes, this whole process is way easier, but with stars, you're going to have a lot of corners. Notice the fluffiness that adds. We don't want to overfill it because that can cause the fluff to start peeking through our stitches. But we want to add enough fluff to give it a little bit of texture. And I do each point of the star as well as a little bit of fluff in the center. Now this star is on the bigger size. What is it there? 1, 2, 3, 4-ish inches big, according to my grid mat there. When you're doing littler stars, you don't have to do quite as much filling, of course, and just putting a little stuffing into each corner is enough. All right, you saw my hole there was still open, and then I'm just going to finish off my stitching to close up that hole. When I get to the end, I will loop my thread back through that same loop, pull it tight, and then I will loop it through that thread one more time, pull it tight. And then here is how I kind of hide that bit of a knot. I will go ahead and stick my needle into that space through the fluff of the little star and pull it up through the middle. Now, if you tug that thread just a little bit snug, it will squish the star down a little bit. And then when you clip it and let go of the star, the loft of the star will suck that thread back in and hide the end of that thread. All right, let's talk about a couple of other stitching things that will happen to you. You will run out of thread at some point. What I like to do is open up my edge, send my needle around the stitch that you can see inside. Go ahead and send it around one more time. And this time you want to send your needle back through the loop that is formed there. And that will create a knot and hold everything in place. So I'm going to pull that pretty tight, but still making sure that it's not pulling the rest of my stitches overly tight. All right, when you start stitching again, this will be a little bit different. What you want to do is send your needle through the back of your fabric, kind of where your last stitch was. When you pull it through, kind of tuck that knot in place so it's hidden. Send your needle through the previous flat stitch along the edge of the fabric so that when you pull it snug, that new thread is going to want to line up again along the edge of the fabric. And then we can keep going with our regular stitches. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned having your tail. If your tail gets too close to where you're stitching, it's going to cause tangling. So you want to be sure as you're working to keep pulling your needle so that it keeps shortening your tail, and you don't want that tail to be much longer than the halfway point. Okay, that wraps up our stars. I hope you appreciated this kind of in-depth stitching tutorial on the blanket stitch. And here are my finished stars, and I think they're very sweet. They could even make sweet little gifts for younger kids, the kids who are beyond putting things in their mouths. So say the age of 4 and 5 would be perfect. Next up, we're going to be making our own postage stamps using products on the card making market. And I'm using the Waffle Flower Postage Collage die set. This is intended for an A2 size card, and it's a die that cuts out a sheet of postage style stamps. These stamps are a hot trend in the card making market, and there are plenty of companies that offer postage style products. I like Waffle Flower because they have lots of add-ons to go with their postage, and I like the size of their die, and they have these extra shapes if you want to create shaped postage as well. So this add-on stencil called the Postage Collage Coloring Stencil, I believe. You can see the title there on the screen. It has this piece, which is a masking stencil for your postage, and you'll see what we do with this in a minute. You do have to make sure it's lined up correctly in order to use it, but we'll get to that some more. It also has some patterns that you can add to your postage, and here's another set that I have for this. I don't think I'm going to use it today, but just know that it has lots of options out there from various holidays and other themes to go with these. All right, I am pulling out other stamps from my stash. While Waffle Flower does offer stamps to go with these, I chose not to buy any of those because I have plenty of stamps in my stash. All you have to really do is look for stamps of the size that will fit. I'm really excited about this mushroom stamp because one of the elements in our inspiration kit when we built our scrapbooking kit this month was mushrooms, so I'm definitely going to bring that in. And then this stamp is slightly larger than will fit in an opening, and I will show you how to approach that in a little bit. And then I just have some other stamps randomly here and there that I have images that I think will work for what I want to work with this month. All right, I pulled out some alabaster cardstock from Spellbinders. You can see the difference in color between a plain white cardstock, and this will tone down our colors a little bit, and it will go with the mood of the scrapbook kit I put together this month. And if you don't know about my scrapbook kit builds, I'll link you up down below and up in the corner. Now, I've die cut this postage set out, and if you have little bits of circles still adhered where those postage, quote unquote, tears apart, you can go ahead and pop those out by gently rubbing a piercing tool along the edge. Now, the best way to get those to pop out on their own is to make sure your die is clean. Those little tidbits tend to stick in all the grooves, and having this kind of brushy tool, this is also made by Spellbinders to help clean out the nooks and crannies, will help you get clean cuts. So here we go. I got this cut. Most of them are already out, and when I rub my tool over them, the rest of them just kind of fall right out. So cleaning your tools makes sense. When we go to work on our postage, we want to make sure we're working on the front. The front is the one there on the right, and the back is the one there on the left. You can see the difference for yourself. Make sure you are working on the front. Make sure your stencil is working on the front by being able to read the branding words on there. And then you can line up your stencil over your postage. This is going to cover up both the little perforated edges that you can use to cut these stamps apart into individual pieces. Also, there's a little stitching line around the outside edge of the stamp, and that covers up that as well. So when you create your artwork, it will have a nice margin within all of those borders. I am going to create this first sheet mostly the same. I am going to create little scenes using a sky and ground ink blending. I should note here that I am using my Sizzix stamp and stencil tool, which has a sticky grid to it to hold everything down. If you don't have one of these, go ahead and tape everything down with some low tack tape so it won't shift on you. So I am using a small blending brush and a very light color of ink, and I can add the layers up a little bit to get the depth of color that I want. And I am tapping off on the lid to make sure I'm not getting blotches of ink, and you'll see that go wrong a little bit later. Now I'm using this angled shading brush, and this one happens to be from Honeybee Stamps. There's lots of brands out there. I like the angle of this one for doing this kind of flicking motion that I'm gonna do next. So I'm going to make sure I tap off lots of this ink because this is a brown. It's very dark. If I went straight in with my ink, it would look like mud. So I'm just trying to get a haze of a ground color there. All right, with all of mine done, you can see my blue did go wrong. Now, that is a problem with the type of blending tool that I'm using. This has a very curved edge, both from front to back and side to side. And if you get ink intensely on the tip of the brush and then you tip that onto your paper, that's going to put an intense splodge. So you do have to try and ink these up right in the middle and try and keep them flat down and keep it in the middle, because if you tip it, it can cause a splodge. So the other style of blending brush that I use the brown with may be a better fit for this kind of ink blending. All right, with some ink blending tips out of the way, let's go ahead and start decorating our areas. Because of those blotches, I decided to use that as, instead of a mistake, it's an opportunity to embellish. And I'm going to pull out some of these stamps, which are weather related, and I'm going to create myself a stormy sky. Stormy sky stamp would be great for telling harder stories, and I definitely am one to tell all the stories from the good and exciting to the sad and frustrating. So this particular stamp may come in useful at some point in my crafting. I don't know about this month, but I will always stick it in my stash if it doesn't work this time, and it'll be ready for another time. All right, another thing to note when you're stamping over these masks is that the thickness of the mask can cause a gap between where the stamp runs off the edge. So you do have to press a little bit harder where the edge of that mask is. Whether you're doing this with a block or like I'm doing it with a stamping tool, just know that you have to press on that edge a little bit. But what's nice is you can use those edges of the masks to kind of give your artwork a little more of an organic flow with things kind of blending off the edges. All right, I've created a little 3-cloud scene here, and I'm adding an umbrella with its own raindrops on there. And that is my first little scene. I'm keeping it really simple with this one, but I'll show you some more detailed ones later. There was also some branches in the inspiration that we worked with this month for building our kits, and I wanted to be sure to include some branches in here, so I'm doing it with my stamps. And this is where I just realized it gets confusing between talking about art stamps to make the artwork versus the postage stamps, which are the embellishments that we're making. At any rate, I'm just going to keep going with this project, and I will try to avoid the word stamp. All right, I'm definitely not going to show you everything I do because I did make a lot of these, but I will point out a couple of tips, tricks, and techniques that I did while I was working. So my next image here is going to be these mushrooms. As you can see, the stamp set is gone yellow. This was a really old stamp that is one of the early versions of photopolymer, which will yellow over the time. It doesn't affect the quality of the stamp, but they have improved photopolymer since then, and it's much less likely to yellow with age these days. All right, I am using this ink from Concord in 9th. In fact, all my inks are. And this one in particular is called Mushroom, and I love that I'm stamping mushrooms with my mushroom ink. And I really like this color because it is a gray-brown, and we're going to do some watercoloring. So first thing I do is stamp my image a couple of times to get a good coat of ink. Sometimes, depending on your paper, if you just touch a wet paintbrush to the ink, it will start bleeding out. And here you can see it is bleeding out just a little bit, and it's turning into its own watercolor paint. Now, it wasn't quite as dark as I want it to be, so I'm going back to the lid of my ink pad, which happens to have some ink on it. If yours doesn't, you can smash some ink onto a piece of plastic and pick it up that way. And then I'm adding darker tones of this color just to a couple of spots, just to give some variation. I stamped a second mushroom, and I'm doing exactly the same thing. I used the wet brush first to pick up and activate the stamping ink, and then I'm using my paintbrush to add extra darkness to other areas. So I have done various things to this image, and you can see I'm all done with my little graphics, and I think they are beautiful. I am pleased with everything that came out here. I am going to go ahead and cut these all apart. It works a little bit better if you cut long edges from edge to edge first and then cut crosswise across the other ones, and that way you don't have awkward edges where those little perforation circles got nipped funny. So let's talk about stamps that are too big to fit in just one opening. If you have a really large stamp, you can just stamp it across all of the openings. I'm going to show you a little technique here where you can get half the stamp on one side and then go ahead, if you want to, and stamp the other half on the other side. What's particularly challenging about this stamp is that you can't see through it. It is a cling stamp and not a photopolymer stamp. So I am going to use a technique to help me figure out where to line this up. In order to do that, I'm going to use a scrap piece of plastic that was product packaging. I'm going to overlay everything with that plastic. Sometimes these plastics will have a little hole in them that are there from the manufacturer, so just avoid that area of the plastic. I'm going to tape it down because some of these stamps can stick to the plastic and then pull it up and shift it and move it, and that can be a problem, which I have later on in the video. But then I put my stamp in place where I think it will look good, and I'm going to go ahead and ink up that stamp, and then I will stamp it down on that plastic. When I lift up my stamp, I can see that it's totally crooked, so I'm glad I did a test run before doing the actual thing. It's really easy to just wipe the ink off that plastic because this water-based ink does not stick to plastic, and I can try it again. All right, with my stamp where I want it to be, I am going to go ahead and mask off other edges of the area so I don't overstamp by accident. It's not really an issue here, but if you have a stamp that it is an issue with, you can go ahead and do this. And then I go ahead and stamp it down, and I can peel off my masking tape, and there is my little image on one of my stamps. Now, I wouldn't normally wipe away this ink on the masking stencil at this point because it can accidentally smudge over, but I wanted to show you where that image ended because I am going to use a piece of tape to cover up that side of the stamp so that in the next cell over, the next postage stamp over, I can get the back half of the image. I'm going to use the edge of the tape and line that up with the edge of my masking stencil. Now here I'm going to fold my tape down to give myself a little handle so that the tape doesn't stick to my fingers and shift and move. Once that's in place, I can pick up my stamp. I'm going to leave that tape on there so that when I ink up that stamp, it won't get ink on the front half of the stamp, and then I can peel that tape away. So there you can see I've inked one half. I can peel that tape away, and now my ink will only be on that extra half of the stamp. So I practiced, my plastic shifted, and then when I did the real one, you can see it's a little bit shifted, but I'm okay with that. I'm okay. I'm just going to move on. And I'm adding more decoration and artwork to this. I'm adding a little bit of splatters. I'm building up little sceneries with more kind of foliage pieces and little flower pieces. And I'm just keep going. All right, notice I'm using a totally different color scheme here. I've got browns and blacks and reds for this section of stamps. You can do every single little image on this piece totally different if you want to. So it's all up to you. Because these ones are a little bit simple, I wanted to add just a haze of color all the way around the images so that, as you see here, they look more like a complete image that doesn't just run off the edge of the postage stamp. So there you go. I've got this next set of stamps, and I did create some imagery that will go with an Alice in Wonderland theme because I do have some Alice in Wonderland scrapbook layouts to make, hopefully this month, with these themed products that I'm specifically designing to go with my projects. All right, I am adding to this final sheet of stamps just a few more details. I changed up my color scheme a little bit here. Also, I've got blues now with my reds and blacks and browns. And I'm adding more of the postage look to this. So these are these little wavy lines that are the postage cancellation stamps that the post office puts on your stamps once it's gone through the mail. There's also the cancellation circles. I have a few other stamps that are just texture images. So I'm just adding layers of detail to this, and I'm using these layers specifically in a gray ink. It's a light gray ink that I can keep restamping over to get a darker color as I go. And here's one of those circles, and this set has little cents costs on them, so you can stamp those into the corners and increase the postage vibe even more. All right, here is a final look at my favorites with the rest of all my creations in the background. And that wraps up this postage collage section. And I'll go ahead and leave you with the images that we looked at in the previous sections of this video. Let me know if you like this longer composite tutorial format, because YouTube tends to get my videos out to viewers when they're separate individual topics. So let me know and I can decide how to move forward with these longer style videos in the future. And until next time, I hope you have an artful day.